In the summer of 1518, a woman stepped into a street in the city of Strasbourg and began to dance. There was no music. There was no festival. She simply danced, and she could not stop. She danced through that day and into the night, and when she finally dropped from exhaustion, she got up and danced again. Within days, others joined her. Within weeks, dozens of people were dancing in the streets helplessly for days at a time. Some, by some accounts, danced until they collapsed and did not get up. And here is the strangest part. This is not a folk tale or a legend that grew in the retelling. It is one of the best documented mysteries in the history of medicine, written down at the time by chroniclers, by physicians, and by the city's own officials. It really happened, and more than 500 years later, we still cannot fully explain it. This is the story of the dancing plague of 1518, a town that could not stop dancing, and the answers that still don't quite fit. This is the Long Archives, where we take the strangest events in the record and sort what we actually know from what we only imagine. If you like history kept honest, facts first, theories labeled as theories, subscribe and stay to the end. To understand how an entire town could dance itself to ruin, you have to understand how close to the edge that town already was. Strasbourg in 1518 was a prosperous city on the Rhine, but the years around it had been brutal. The region had been hammered by repeated failed harvests and famine. The poor were hungry, sometimes starving. On top of the hunger came disease. Smallpox, syphilis, and other illnesses moved through crowded streets where people lived close together with little medicine that worked. Winters were bitter. For ordinary people, life was a thin margin between getting by and going under, and many had already slipped. And it was not only the body that was under siege, it was the mind. This was a deeply religious world where misfortune was read as judgment and where the line between the natural and the supernatural was thin and porous. People genuinely believed that saints could reward the faithful and punish the wicked with very physical afflictions. Among those beliefs was one that matters enormously for this story: the dread of a saint named Saint Vitus. It was widely held that Saint Vitus had the power to strike people down with a curse of wild, uncontrollable dancing.
Are you all right?
To anger him, or simply to be unlucky, was to risk being made to dance against your will. And this fear was not vague or abstract. It had a history people could point to. Stories circulated of earlier outbreaks, of towns where men and women had been seized by the same compulsion and danced until they dropped. The church taught that such afflictions were real, divine punishments or saintly curses made flesh, and ordinary people had no reason to doubt it. Saint Vitus was a known danger, the way a contagious disease is a known danger. Something that happened to real people in real towns that might happen to you. So the dread of the dancing curse was not a private superstition. It was a shared, concrete expectation, sitting ready in the collective imagination, waiting for a spark. So picture the setting: a population worn down by famine and plague, frightened and primed with a specific vivid fear. The fear of being forced to dance. That combination of bodily suffering and a shared belief about exactly how a curse might look is the soil in which everything that followed would grow. Hold on to it, because by the end it will matter more than any fungus or poison. Into that summer stepped one woman. The records give her a name: Frau Troffea.
According to this map, they control
One day
the
in
river
July, she
access.
walked out
The
into a
siege cannot
narrow
hold much
Strasbourg
longer,
street
but
and
if we
started to
surrender
dance,
now, the terms will be
silently and
catastrophic
alone.
for the city.
Her husband, The accounts say begged her to stop. She did not. Perhaps could not. She danced for hours, then for days, pausing only when her body gave out. Then, beginning again.
The diagnosis is clear.
People
You
gathered
both
to
are suffering
watch,
from
and then,
overheated hot blood,
instead of the
a
strange
severe
spell
imbalance
breaking,
of the humors.
it spread. Within about a week, more than 30 other people had joined her, and the thing began to look less like one woman's breakdown
Make sure that
and
plank
more
is
like an
flush, son.
outbreak.
We need a
The
solid
dancing was not
foundation before
joyful.
we nail it in.
Witnesses described it as compulsive and exhausting. People moving as if they had no choice, their faces showing fear and pain rather than pleasure. They danced in the markets and the open squares in the heat of a Rhineland summer, hour after hour, with bleeding feet and swollen legs, unable to rest. Over the following weeks, the numbers climbed. The exact total is uncertain. The sources and later estimates range widely, from dozens of dancers to as many as 400 at the peak. Whatever the precise figure, it was enough to frighten a whole city. And this is the point worth pausing on, because it is what separates this event from 1,000 vague medieval legends. People wrote it down as it was happening. Local chroniclers recorded the outbreak. Physicians left notes on what they saw and what they prescribed. And crucially, the city's own administration documented its decisions. The measures taken, the spaces cleared, the orders given. We are not reconstructing this from a single rumor passed down for centuries. We have layered, independent records from the time and place made by people with no incentive to invent a mass delusion.
Thank you for staying with me.
That is extraordinarily rare for an event this strange. And it is the reason historians treat the dancing plague not as a myth to be debunked, but as a real occurrence to be explained. Now, what would you do if you were in charge? Here is where the story takes a turn that sounds almost like a dark joke. Except that it really happened. And it made everything worse. The authorities
Hear our
turned to the
prayers, O
physicians,
Lord,
and the physicians
and grant us
turned
your
to the
peace
medical
in this
theory of the
time
day.
of affliction.
Medicine in 1518 still ran on the ancient idea of the four humors, the notion that health was a balance of fluids in the body, and that illness came from too much of one of them. The learned conclusion was that the dancers were suffering from hot blood, an overheating of the body that had to be worked out of
What
the system.
happened?
And if the problem was that they needed to dance it out, then the cure was obvious. Let them dance. Help them dance. Dancers it out of them. So the city did something extraordinary. Rather than restraining the afflicted, the authorities cleared spaces for them. They opened up guild halls and marketplaces. They reportedly built wooden stages so the dancers would have room. And this is the part that is hard to believe. They hired musicians and even brought in professional dancers to keep the rhythm going and accompany the sufferers in the belief that this would help them finish the fit and
I wanna call
recover.
it an epidemic, but the
You can
data, the
guess what
history in these
happened.
volumes points
Far from
overwhelmingly
curing
to mass
anyone,
psychogenic
the
response.
music
We've
and the
seen this
cleared
before.
squares and the spectacle did the opposite. They drew crowds. They gave the outbreak a stage, quite literally, and more people were pulled in. The dancing spread and lasted longer. The cure was pouring fuel on the fire. Eventually, the city realized its mistake, and the policy reversed completely. The music stopped. Public dancing was banned across Strasbourg, and the afflicted were gathered up and taken out of the city up into the hills to a shrine dedicated to that very saint they feared, Saint Vitus. There, before his altar, they were given red shoes and led in rites meant to lift the curse, prayed over in the hope that the holy site would do what the doctors could not. And then, over the late summer and into autumn, the outbreak faded. By around September, the dancing had stopped. The town somehow felt still. So what on earth had happened? For 5 centuries, People have tried to answer that, and the explanations fall into two main camps, both of which are revealing, and neither of which fully closes the case.
We need immediate
The
medical
first
assistance at
explanation
school.
is a poison.
It's an emergency.
Some
Several students are
researchers
ill.
have proposed that the dancers were victims of ergotism, poisoning by ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on damp rye and other grains. Ergot contains compounds chemically related to LSD, and people who eat bread made from contaminated grain can suffer convulsions, twitching, and terrifying hallucinations. In a hungry city eating whatever bread it could get, the idea is tempting. Bad grain, a tainted harvest, a whole population mildly poisoned into madness. But the ergot theory has serious problems. The kind of poisoning that causes convulsions also tends to cut off blood flow to the limbs, producing burning pain and, in severe cases, gangrene. Fingers and toes going black and dying. That is a horrifying condition, but it is not one that lets you dance. Ergotism makes the body seize and the limbs fail. It does not produce sustained, coordinated, days-long dancing in dozens of people at once. And there is no good reason a mass poisoning would express itself as the very specific behavior the whole culture already feared. As an explanation, ergot fits the setting, but not the symptoms. There is another problem with blaming the bread, and it is a quiet but powerful one. If a whole population had been poisoned by contaminated grain, you would expect the affliction to ease only when the bad food was gone, and you would not expect it to be cured by being marched up a mountain to pray at a shrine. Yet that is roughly what the records suggest happened. The outbreak responded to changes in setting, belief, and treatment, not to a change in diet. People who supposedly ate the same poisoned bread were not all affected, and the thing faded in a way that tracks far more closely with the mind than with the stomach. Poison does not usually care where you stand or what you believe. This affliction seemed to care about almost nothing else. Which brings us to the second and now more widely accepted explanation. And it is, in its own way, stranger than any poison. The leading modern account, argued most prominently by the medical historian John Whalley, is that the dancing plague was a case of mass psychogenic illness, what older language called mass hysteria. The idea is that under conditions of extreme stress, the famine, the disease, the fear, the human mind can produce real physical symptoms with no physical cause. Not faking, not pretending, genuine, involuntary bodily effects generated by the mind under unbearable pressure. And here is where that earlier detail becomes the key to the whole thing. For a stress reaction to take the form of dancing, specifically dancing, the people involved had to already believe deeply that this was a thing that could happen to them. They did. They lived in a culture saturated with the fear of Saint Vitus and his curse of compulsive dance. So when one desperate, exhausted woman fell into a kind of trance and began to move, she was not doing something random. She was acting out the exact nightmare her whole society shared. And in a frightened, suggestible population, that nightmare proved contagious. Not through a germ, but through the mind. One person's breakdown became a template that others, under the same crushing stress and the same belief, unconsciously followed. It is worth saying that this was not the first time. There are records of similar dancing outbreaks in the same broad region in earlier centuries, including a notable one in the 1370s.
What is that thing?
Whatever was happening in Strasbourg, it was a recurring pattern in that culture, not a one-off, which fits the idea of a shared belief waiting under the right pressure to express
The
itself.
affliction is spreading faster than we
And yet,
anticipated.
be
It has already
honest,
reached the riverland.
even the
We must
mass
quarantine the
hysteria
area
explanation
immediately, or
does
all
not
is lost.
fully satisfy. We can name the ingredients: the stress, the belief, the suggestibility. But naming the recipe is not the same as watching the meal cook. We cannot run the experiment. We cannot interview the dancers and the sheer physical extremity of it. Ordinary, undernourished people dancing for days past the point of injury remains hard to fully picture, even when we accept the psychology behind it. The records are real and frustratingly incomplete. They tell us what people saw, but not quite enough to settle what it was. Step back, and the dancing plague stops being a medieval curiosity and becomes something more uncomfortable. A window into how the human mind actually works. Because the unsettling truth underneath the leading explanation is this: if it was mass psychogenic illness, then it was not a freak of a superstitious past that we have safely outgrown. The same mechanism is still with us. Outbreaks of mass psychogenic illness are documented in the modern world. In schools, in factories, in
What
offices.
began in 1374
Groups of people
as the
developing
dancing
real
plague
symptoms,
resurfaced repeatedly.
fainting, twitching,
Strasbourg in
illness,
1518 was
with no
particularly
physical
severe.
cause ever found, spreading through a community by anxiety and suggestion alone. The costume changes with the century. In 1518, the shared fear was a dancing saint. Today, it might be a suspected gas leak or a strange smell, but the underlying capacity for a frightened group to generate genuine physical symptoms together is the same. We are not as separate from those Strasbourg dancers as we would like to believe. The modern examples are well documented. In 1962, in a textile factory in the United States, dozens of workers fell ill with nausea, dizziness, and rashes, convinced they had been bitten by a mysterious insect in a shipment of cloth. Investigators searched hard and never found a bug or a toxin capable of causing it.
I don't feel so good.
The epidemic had spread through anxiety,
My stomach
person
really
to
hurts.
person, along the lines
Is
of who
everyone okay?
talked to whom.
No detectable
That same
pathogens.
year,
It just
in a
doesn't add
girls'
up.
school in East
We have
Africa,
to be missing
an
something.
outbreak of
These results say
uncontrollable
everything's
laughing and
fine,
crying
but it isn't.
swept through the students and then
As you
jumped to
can see,
nearby
the
villages,
stimulus leads
lasting
directly to
on
our
and off for
expectation,
months,
which then
with
dictates
no
the behavior
physical
and the
cause
eventual
ever
outcome.
identified. Different century, different costume. An insect, a fit of laughter, a dancing saint, but the same underlying engine. Real symptoms, no physical trigger, transmitted by fear and suggestion through a tight-knit, stressed community. And that points to the real reason a story like this grips us. It is tempting to file the dancing plague under things that could never happen now, to treat it as proof of how far we have come. The harder, more interesting reading is the opposite, that it shows us something permanent about ourselves. Put human beings under enough fear, give them a shared script for how the fear should look, and the body can follow the mind into places that seem impossible. That is not magic. It may be more disturbing than magic because it is real and it is in us. There is also a quieter lesson about the limits of certainty. We have the chronicles, we have the city records, we have, by the standards of the 16th century, an unusually good paper trail. And it is still not enough to give us a clean, final answer. Sometimes the honest position is not, here is what happened, but here is what we know, here is our best theory, and here is the gap we cannot close. That is not a failure of history. It is history being truthful about its own edges. If you find that kind of honesty more interesting than a tidy myth, then subscribe and you'll get a new entry from the archive every Sunday. So, let us be exact about what is known. In the summer of 1518, in Strasbourg, a woman began to dance in the street and could not stop. Over the following weeks, dozens of people, by some accounts many more, were caught up in the same compulsion, dancing helplessly for days. The city's physicians, believing they were curing hot blood, encouraged the dancing and made it worse, before reversing course, banning music and carrying the afflicted to a shrine of Saint Vitus. By autumn, it was over. All of this was recorded at the time, which is why we can be sure it happened at all. Everything else remains open. We do not know for certain how many people died, if any. The contemporary records are silent on a toll, and the dramatic numbers came later. And we do not know with finality what caused it. The poison theory does not fit the symptoms. The mass hysteria theory fits best but cannot be proven and leaves the sheer physical strangeness only half explained. A narrow medieval street in the heat of summer and figures moving to music no one else can hear. Moving until they fall and then rising to move again. It was not a legend. It was written down. And it remains one of the few well-documented events in human history that we can describe in detail and still not fully understand.